Elia moved through the void of space, a specter of ice and silence. Planets came and went, civilizations rose and fell, but she remained, a curse that walked, a death that could think. Wherever she went, life perished. The moment her flesh met another's, the cold consumed them, freezing them to the core, leaving only statues of frost in her wake. No being, no species, no god or demon had ever survived her touch. She had stopped trying to belong centuries ago. The universe had made its judgment. She was not meant to exist among the living. So she wandered, watching from afar, never daring to hope. But then, whispers reached her ears, stories of a species unlike any other, a race that defied reason, survived where none should, and broke the very rules of nature itself. The humans, at first, she dismissed them as myths. No creature could endure absolute cold, just as none had ever survived her presence. Yet, the more she observed, the more she doubted her certainty. They built homes in frozen wastelands, carved lives out of ice and death. They laughed in the face of the cold, wrapped in nothing but fragile layers of fabric. They burned their fires, breathed warmth into frozen air, and lived where others perished. Curiosity gnawed at her, something she had long thought dead. What if it was true? What if these beings were different? And so, for the first time in centuries, Elia made a choice. She set her course for Earth. Elia stood atop a frozen peak, her presence unnoticed in the howling blizzard. The world below was harsh, yet humans thrived in it. She watched as one of them, a lone figure in heavy gear, moved through the storm, step by determined step. He was struggling. The cold clawed at his body, ice forming in his beard, yet he pushed forward. Any other species would have succumbed, yet he endured. Elia had seen many creatures fight against death, but humans refused to acknowledge it at all. Then, as if sensing her gaze, he turned. For the first time in centuries, someone looked at her and did not run. His eyes were steady, curious, assessing rather than fearful. A strange feeling stirred within her. The man stepped closer. "You lost out here too?" His voice was rough, strained by the cold. Elia remained silent. He didn't seem to expect an answer. Instead, he reached into his pack and pulled out a thermal blanket, offering it to her as if she needed warmth. She stared at him, stunned by the absurdity. He had no idea what she was. No idea that if she reached out, his body would turn to ice in an instant. "You will freeze to death," he said, concern evident in his voice. She hesitated. A warning sat on the edge of her tongue, but before she could speak, he did something unthinkable. He removed his glove and reached for her. Elia braced for the inevitable, waiting for his body to seize, for his flesh to turn brittle, for his heart to stop. Nothing happened. His fingers brushed against her skin, warm despite the ice that should have consumed him. The cold did not take him. He did not freeze. He did not die. She stared, a silent question in her expression. He smiled. "Huh, guess I'm tougher than I thought." Elia was no longer certain who between them was the impossible one. That Daniel led her back to his camp, walking as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Elia followed, her mind racing. She had lived long enough to know the impossible when she saw it, yet here he was, alive. Inside the tent, warmth from a small heater filled the space, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were fixed on him. He should have died. Every species did. Every creature that had ever touched her had turned to ice, their bodies shattering like glass. Yet this human stood before her, rubbing his hands together for warmth unaffected. "You're quiet," he said, pouring a cup of something hot. Cold shock. He grinned at his own joke. She watched him, still trying to make sense of what had happened. "Why didn't you freeze?" Daniel shrugged. "Good question." He handed her the cup before realizing she wasn't going to take it. "I don't know. Maybe I'm just built different." His tone was light, but the weight of the mystery settled between them. She had to understand. Daniel, ever the curious human, ran his own tests. He held out his arm again, inviting her to touch his bare skin. Hesitant, she placed her fingers against his wrist. Again, nothing. No ice, no death, just the steady, undeniable warmth of human life. Maybe it's heat resistance, he mused. Or something about body composition. Humans are weird like that. We survive stuff we're not supposed to. Ilya considered this. It was true. They endured fire, radiation, the crushing pressures of the deep. They adapted, evolved, and fought against nature itself. Unlike other species, they didn't accept limitations. She thought back to the civilizations she had watched from a distance. Species that perished at the first sign of hardship. Humans didn't perish. They conquered. You are different, she admitted. Daniel leaned back, satisfied. Yeah, we tend to be. Ilya had spent centuries believing she was untouchable. Now, for the first time, she questioned if it was truly a curse, or if she had simply never met the right kind of people. Ilya sat in silence, staring at her hand. For the first time in her endless existence, she wasn't a bringer of death. She wasn't an omen to be feared. She wasn't alone. A part of her resisted the thought. If humans were the only ones immune, what did that mean? Was it a fluke, or had the universe crafted them differently? She had spent lifetimes avoiding contact. Yet here was Daniel, unbothered, sipping his drink as if touching a living weapon was just another day for him. What now? He asked. You heading back to space? She considered it. Leaving was a logical choice. Staying meant risking exposure. If others learned about her, they would want to study her, fear her, perhaps even destroy her. That was how the universe worked. But then again, humans never followed the rules. Daniel stretched, shaking off the cold. You know, you don't have to leave. His voice was casual, but the weight of the offer was heavy. Not every story has to end the way it begins. Ilya looked at him, at the absurd warmth in his expression, at the ridiculous optimism humans carried even in the face of the impossible. No one had ever offered her anything but fear. No one had ever looked at her and seen a person instead of a curse. She reached out, slowly, deliberately, and placed her hand over his. Not to test, not to question, just to feel. Daniel grinned. Guess that settles it. Ilya, the untouchable, had been touched. And for the first time, she let herself believe in something beyond solitude.